YouTube.com/BookTV. Up next on Book TV, Maya Jasanoff presents a history of about 60,000 Americans who were loyal to the British Empire after the Revolutionary War. Fearing retribution, many of these loyalists fled to Canada, Jamaica, and other locales that were then under British control. This is about 50 minutes.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex Merriweather. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's Friday Forum with Professor Maya Jasanoff, here to discuss her newest book, Liberty's Exiles. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment and mention a few of our upcoming author talks. Upcoming events include James Carroll on March 11th, discussing his new book, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, How the Ancient City Ignited Our Modern World, and Harlow Giles Unger on April 4th for American Tempest, How the Boston Tea Party Sparked a Revolution. Upcoming ticketed events include James Glick, Sarah Vowell, Billy Collins, and Governor Deval Patrick. Find our complete calendar of events online at harvard.com and in our March events flyer. After Professor Jasanoff's talk this afternoon, we'll have time for questions, after which we'll have a book signing here at this table. And you can find copies of Liberty's Exiles up at the registers. Please know when you buy a book from Harvard Bookstore, you are supporting a local independent institution who genuinely cares about books, and this author series would not be possible without that support. We're also pleased to have C-SPAN's Book TV here taping today's event. When asking questions in the Q&A, please know that you'll be recorded, and please wait a moment for the microphone to come over to you before asking your question. And finally, now's a great time to make sure you've silenced your cell phones. This afternoon, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce Maya Jasanoff, here to discuss Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World. Maya Jasanoff is an award-winning historian who brings us a largely untold story in this newest work. The story of 60,000 men and women who remained loyal to the British Empire at the conclusion of the American Revolution. These loyalists decided to leave their homes and become refugees elsewhere in the British Empire and all over the world. The Boston Globe calls Liberty's Exiles a masterful account, and historian Joseph J. Ellis notes, "Losers seldom get to write the history, but the American loyalists have at last got their historian." Jasanoff tells their story with uncommon style and grace. Maya Jasanoff is an associate professor of history at Harvard University. Her first book, Edge of Empire, was awarded the 2005 Duff Cooper Prize and was a Book of the Year selection in The Economist, The Guardian, and The Sunday Times. We're very pleased to bring her to Harvard Bookstore this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Maya Jasanoff.
Well, thank you all for coming, and let me thank Harvard Bookstore for hosting me. I've been coming to this bookstore since my undergraduate days a very long time ago, and I feel like as my reading tastes have matured, Harvard Bookstore has always been here to fulfill them. Let me begin at the beginning with this book. There were two sides in the American Revolution, but only one was on display early in the afternoon of November 25th, 1783, when General George Washington rode on a gray horse into New York City. By his side trotted the governor of New York, flanked by an escort of armed guards. Portly General Henry Knox followed close behind, leading officers of the Continental Army 8 abreast down the Bowery. Long lines of civilians trailed after them, some on horseback, others on foot, wearing black and white cockades and sprigs of laurel in their hats. Hundreds crammed into the streets to watch. Since 1776, through 7 long years of war and peace negotiations, New York had been occupied by the British Army. Today, the British were going. A cannon shot at 1 p.m. sounded the departure of the last British troops from their posts. They marched to the docks, clambered into longboats, and rowed out into the transports waiting in the harbor. The British occupation of the United States was officially over. George Washington's triumphal entrance into New York City was the closest thing that the winners of the American Revolution ever had to a victory parade. And for a week, patriots celebrated the evacuation with feasts and bonfires, illuminations, and the largest fireworks display ever seen in North America. Generations of New Yorkers commemorated November 25th as Evacuation Day, an anniversary that was later folded into the more enduring November celebration of national togetherness, Thanksgiving Day. But what if you hadn't wanted the British to leave? Mixed in among the happy New York crowd that November day, there were other, less cheerful faces. For Loyalists, colonists who had sided with Britain during the war, the departure of the British troops spelled worry, not jubilation. During the war, tens of thousands of Loyalists had moved for safety into New York and other British-held cities. The British withdrawal now raised urgent questions about their future. What kind of treatment could they expect in the new United States? Would they be jailed? Would they be attacked? Would they retain their property or hold on to their jobs? Confronting real doubts about their lives, liberty, and potential happiness in the United States, 60,000 Loyalists decided to take their chances and follow the British elsewhere into the British Empire. They took 15,000 black slaves with them, bringing the total exodus to 75,000 people, or about 1 in 40 members of the American population. They traveled to Canada, they sailed for Britain, they journeyed to the Bahamas and the West Indies. Some would venture still further afield to Africa, to India. But wherever they went, this voyage into exile was a trip into the unknown. In America, the refugees left behind friends and relatives, careers and land, houses and native streets, the entire milieu in which they had built their lives. For them, America seemed less an asylum to the persecuted, as the Patriots had toasted it, than a potential persecutor. It was the British Empire that would be their asylum, offering land, emergency relief, and financial incentives to help them start over. Evacuation Day did not mark an end for the Loyalist refugees. It was a fresh beginning, and it carried them into a dynamic, if uncertain, new world. Now, I've just read you the first couple of pages of Liberty's Exiles, and in this book what I try to do is lay out and explain what happened to the Loyalists next, because usually our stories end the conflict in 1783, but as I try to show, for this population, the repercussions went on and it unfolded in distant places. And in the book, I try to distill the experiences of these 60,000 civilian refugees into a kind of meaningful overview of what all of this meant. And this afternoon, I'm going to be even more kind of grossly reductionist in my remarks because after sort of sketching out the big picture for you, I'm going to focus on the experience of just one of these 60,000 people. So let me explain a little bit about the big picture. You know, stereotypes still often suggest that Loyalists were shared a kind of elite profile, that they were white, wealthy, Anglican, Anglo-centric members of the colonial population. But in truth, Loyalism ranged right across the spectrum, social, geographic, ethnic, and religious spectrum of early America. Notably, not all Loyalists even were white. About 20,000 black slaves during the Revolution responded to promises extended by British governors to offer them freedom if they agreed to come and join the Redcoats. So again, about 20,000 Patriot-owned slaves joined the British. This makes it, I think, the largest mass emancipation in American history until the era of the Civil War. And by the same token, many American Indian nations were also drawn into this conflict and divided by it. And for them, they had often been harassed for generations by land-hungry colonists. Some of them had indeed been allied with Britain over the course of previous wars against France and so on. And so many Native Americans also joined the war on the British side, notably the Mohawks in the north and the Creeks in the south. So loyalism is cuts right across the population of early America. And there's a final element of the stereotype that I think is worth correcting. Loyalists are often referred to as Tories quote unquote. And Tory is the nickname for the British Conservative Party. And the implication is, well, Loyalists were conservatives. They couldn't see that the future, the innovation was to become Republican. Now, in fact, many prominent Loyalists were actually reformers in their own way. And they advanced schemes for imperial reform that are worth paying attention to and that actually anticipate much, much later developments elsewhere in the British Empire. And so for most of the people who were caught on the front lines of this conflict, which they called a civil war, not a revolution, this wasn't so much a war of ideals as it was often a war of ordeals, a war in which violence came to their front doors. They had windows smashed, livestock poisoned, property seized by the state. And violence, the violence of the war, at least as much as ideology, actually ends up being very important in impelling tens of thousands of Loyalists to take shelter in British-held cities during the war and then to decide to leave the colonies at the end of it. So what happened to them next, and where did they go? Well, fewer than 15% of these refugees went back to Britain. And it wasn't back for most of them, because for all that American colonists had often been raised to think of Britain as home, very few of them had actually ever been there. And so when they went to Britain, they found themselves in a quite alien place that was very different from the surroundings that they had known here in the colonies. The vast majority of the Loyalists, about more than half of them, relocated to eastern Canada, particularly to Nova Scotia, which received something like 30,000 of these refugees, doubling the provincial population overnight, leading to the creation of a whole separate province, that of New Brunswick, to accommodate these new arrivals. So very transformative impact in Canada. And another 10,000 or so of these Loyalists moved south, particularly those who had lived in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and they traveled to Jamaica and the Bahamas, and they brought with them the vast majority of those exported slaves, the 15,000 slaves who traveled along with the white and black Loyalists. And some of the Loyalists, it should be noted, even ranged further afield. The most surprising aspect of this migration happened in 1791 when 1,200 of the black Loyalists, the freed slaves, moved from their initial place of refuge in Canada across the ocean to West Africa. They did it under the sponsorship of British abolitionists who wanted to found a free black colony on the coast of West Africa, and the black Loyalists were the pioneer settlers of what became Freetown in Sierra Leone. They were a bit more fortunate than some other black Loyalists who ended up among the convicts on the first fleet bound for Australia. And some other Loyalists even end up in India, including, in fact, two sons of one of the most infamous Loyalists of all, the turncoat Benedict Arnold. And Arnold has two sons who go to India. He even has a half-Indian grandchild. And so I like to think there's sort of Arnold lineage on the other side of the world. So the point of this is that within just a few years of the end of the revolution, the map of the Loyalist diaspora, and there's actually a map of it in a few pages into this book, the map of the Loyalist diaspora looks a lot like the map of the British Empire as a whole. And this points to one of the key features that I wanted to signal about the significance of looking at this diaspora, because it really helps make sense of a seeming paradox. The American Revolution was the greatest single defeat for the British Empire until the era of World War II. This was the greatest loss of territory. It plunged the empire into enormous debt. It was particularly a sort of humiliating kind of defeat as they saw their own closest colonists, people that they had thought of in many ways as brethren, break away. And yet, within just a decade or so, Britain had bounced back to a striking extent, and it was to be the British Empire that was the leading world power for the entirety of the 19th century. So how do we explain the paradox of Britain coming out of a devastating defeat, and yet in very short order going on to rule the world? Well, we usually think about the sort of international significance of the American Revolution in terms of the spirit of 1776, right? The values that, helped mobilize other people around the world to express their own desire for liberty. But in fact, I contend it's by looking at the revolution's impact on the enduring British Empire that we can see an equally significant international consequence of this war. And in the wake of the American Revolution, we see the British Empire becoming a great loser. They regroup, they consolidate, and they retool in three key ways, which I think we could aptly label the spirit of 1783. Now, you won't hear that necessarily proclaimed in the streets of Tripoli or Tahrir Square. Nevertheless, I think it's worth highlighting the significance of this, again, in making this empire the global hegemon for about a century. So there are three key features to this. One is territorial expansion. And the fact that the map of the Loyalist diaspora looks like the map of the British Empire is not an accident, because a lot of these Loyalists become sort of pioneer settlers in different parts of the empire, such as Sierra Leone. And in fact, the very first scheme to colonize Australia is put forward by an American Loyalist. Another feature of this spirit of 1783 is a kind of clarified sense of imperial purpose, imperial moral purpose, more particularly. And this is apparent in a variety of dimensions, again, regarding Loyalists. So, for example, the British government offers these refugees a whole range of charitable measures to help them get started. They give them free passage to other British domains. They give them land grants where they can establish themselves anew. They give them basic food rations. They give them things like hose and shoes and nails and a whole raft of things that really sort of resemble the kinds of things that modern international aid agencies give out to refugees today. And this moral purpose is also apparent in things like upholding the commitment to freedom to the black Loyalists, which is heavily contested by American patriots who don't like the idea of their former property sailing off into the British Empire, but the British really stick to this. And finally, the British also end up establishing a government commission, which gives Loyalists compensation for the property that they've lost in America. And this is at the time a very novel sort of expansion of contemporary ideas of state welfare, which barely resembled its current forms. So in all these ways, you see this kind of commitment to the empire as a kind of humanitarian entity. And yet there's a final element to all of this, because at the same time that they're being expansive and they're being sort of humanitarian and paternalistic, the British also realize that the defeat in America means they have to change their governing style in certain ways. And in particular, they realize that what's gone wrong in America is that the colonists have been given too much liberty. It's been too easy for them to protest. And so in the aftermath of the American Revolution, you tend to see the British authorities being a bit more tight-handed, a bit more authoritarian, a bit more centralized, a bit more hierarchical. And this ends up coming as something of a shock to the Loyalist refugees who have come out of the colonies where things were a little easier and go into the post-revolutionary empire and find themselves at odds with the new style. And so one of the things I was most surprised by in researching this book is to find that in places as far afield as St. John, New Brunswick, Nassau in the Bahamas, even Freetown, Sierra Leone, you see Loyalists actually rebelling against British authority, asking for things like greater representation and lower taxes, claims that are rather familiar to us from revolutionary history. Now, to give you a flavor of all of this, in the book, those are kind of the big arguments in this book, but it is also very much a narrative history, a history about individual figures. And one of the things I was very concerned to do is to recover the experiences of these people who are a really neglected sort of refugee population in our historical understanding. And so what I want to do with the rest of my time is read to you portions of the book which explain the story of the first refugee who actually kind of drew me into this project. And she was a Georgia Loyalist called Elizabeth Johnston. And she wrote a memoir, which I came across early in my research. In fact, at that point, the memoir was here in Widener. I was not living here, and so I made a photocopy of this memoir and carried it around with me when I moved from one place to another, rather like Elizabeth Johnston, only then to discover that Google Books put it up online in short order, and so that was extremely convenient. Anyway, so Johnston wrote a memoir, which sort of got me into this project, and her story sort of weaves in and out of the book in various ways. And so what I'd like to do is, as I say, give you a bit of a flavor of the book and her life in what remains. Now, she was about 12 years old when the war began. Her father was a well-off, he was a sort of planter in Georgia, reasonably well established on a plantation outside of Savannah. He had a minor government office, and so when the war began, he was accosted by local patriots who wanted him to sign on to a local patriot association, and he refused to do so. A gang came to his door. Basically, he was able to run away on seeing them approach, but his 12-year-old daughter was just left there. Her mother had died. She was an only child, and so she ended up getting sort of packed off into the countryside to stay with relatives and ultimately to stay with some family friends in Savannah. The war went on. The years went on. Her father was fighting with the British in different parts of the North. After 3 years apart, they were finally reunited again when the British retook Savannah. The two of them re-met, and she also at that time met her future husband, a fellow brother officer of her father's. Her father was not happy about this match. Her future husband, William Johnston, was described as one of the dashing fashionables of occupied British New York. He was a sort of gambler and a flirt and very charming. He had been a medical student before the war, but was happy to forsake his books for the gaming table. In any case, the two of them get married. And so it is that Elizabeth Johnston's married life unfolds against the backdrop of British defeat in America. And as the British are sort of pulling out of different locations in the colonies, Elizabeth Johnston and her husband William, who is still in British forces, move with them from one city to another. And so let me try to sort of, again, jumping through different parts of the book, tell you a little bit about this first set of migrations. They're in Charleston, it's being evacuated. They're in Savannah, it's being evacuated, and they join the fleet to go to Charleston with Elizabeth and William together. Now, it was an unusual choice for Elizabeth to go to Charleston with William rather than to St. Augustine, where her in-laws had gone, not least because she was then 7 months pregnant and passed up the offer from a patriot friend of William's to stay in Savannah under his protection until she was, quote, fitter for moving, unquote. But the Johnstons had already been apart for much of their short married life, and Elizabeth wanted no more of it. She had suffered the loneliness of raising their firstborn son, Andrew, a, quote, handsome, sweet fellow with a large proportion of his father's passionate temper, while William was away at war. And she had acquired another reason to wish William close at hand, for beyond her watch, William had fallen into his old habit of gambling, a vice so destructive and ruinous in its nature, she said, that it threatened to wreck their growing family. He did not reveal the alarming extent of his losses to his wife, but wrote to her father with hangdog contrition, imploring Liechtenstein to support the family in their need. What was worse, William's behavior opened a rift with his own father and sisters. "You know not how wretched you have made me," Elizabeth opined, "and 'tis cruel to distress a father whose sole wish and care is to see his children happy." Dr. Lewis Johnston, with his wealth and influential connections, was not a man to be alienated lightly. A rift with him would cut off the young couple from their best source of support and patronage. So when British power collapsed around her in Savannah, Elizabeth Johnston followed her impulse and her spouse. "My husband would not like the separation, and I positively refused to remain." Not once did she mention the issues of principle involved in leaving her home, nor, more strikingly, did she note the obvious impetus for her extended family's departure. Every single one of Johnston's close male relations had been prescribed under the Georgia Confiscation and Banishment Act. But in her own telling, Johnston did not leave for reasons of political sentiment, but for emotional ones, the bond of conjugal love. The Johnstons arrived in Charleston to find that city, too, in the throes of pre-evacuation mayhem. Day in, day out, British officials coped with shortages of food, rum, ships, and cash, rising disorder and falling morale, and more than 10,000 civilians clamoring for relief and reassurance. While they were in this occupied city, it's getting evacuated even around them, Elizabeth Johnston gave birth to the couple's first daughter, Catherine, in the comfort of a stately sequestered house. Around her in the emptying city, everything is in motion and turned topsy-turvy. It is impossible to describe what confusion people of all denominations seem to be in, one soldier noted. The one is buying everything he can to complete his stock of goods. The second is searching for a passage to some other garrison of His Majesty's troops. The third is going from house to house to collect his debts. Though the Johnstons had no property to handle in Charleston, they also faced fresh choices. William's regiment was due to ship out to New York City, along with most of the Charleston garrison. Far away and likely facing imminent evacuation itself, New York made little sense as a destination for Elizabeth and her children. This time they decided that she would head for St. Augustine and stay with William's relatives until he could join them there to establish their first real family home. In early December 1782, Elizabeth Johnston stepped into a small boat with her toddler son, infant daughter, and a black nurse, and rowed out into the harbor to board a Florida-bound schooner. It was like cruising into a jigsaw puzzle. Above her loomed the curved wooden walls of a city afloat, dark with slime and tar, the outlines of figures scurrying along decks and rigging, canvas sails stretched on a lattice of masts. Skiffs and rowboats traced ripples across the water, ferrying loyalists and slaves, barrels of food and supplies, furniture and livestock, even the bells of St. Michael's Church, to the waiting ships. More than 1,200 white loyalists and 2,600 blacks splashed out to join a convoy bound for Jamaica. Another group of 200 black loyalist soldiers gathered to sail for St. Lucia. A few hundred individuals, including various government officials, joined a convoy for Britain. Finally, on the afternoon of December 12th, the soldiers began assembling on the city wharfs to board the transports for New York. 2 days later, the Americans formally reoccupied Charleston, while the Johnstons swayed out to sea in opposite directions, he with the garrison to New York City, she to join the rapidly growing Loyalist community in East Florida. Now, many of these Southern refugees went to East Florida. They thought that this would be the perfect place to rebuild. It was a lot like Georgia, it was a lot like South Carolina and territory. It had land available, and they were promised it as sort of an asylum. The problem, however, was that the British were going to hand Florida over to Spain in the peace treaty, and the Loyalists, when they first went, didn't know that, but it was going to be a horrifying thing. So after 3 tedious weeks, Elizabeth Johnston traveled down the Georgia coast to St. Augustine, boxed up on shipboard, always in motion, even in her sleep. When at last they turned into the St. Augustine Inlet, they felt a stomach-dropping thud as their boat struck a sandbar. Fortunately, they managed to clear the obstruction, which was more than could be said for another Charleston convoy wrecked against the shoals and ruining many refugees' carefully exported property. Half a dozen ships keeled askew on the sand, sentinels of loss. Johnston's first impressions of this flat, foreign place were not good. She found all her in-laws, quote, much dissatisfied with their situation, grumbling over their future prospects. Little Andrew had been sick, the weather seemed constantly wet or cloudy, funny about Florida there, and as she wrote her husband, she repented sincerely of not going with you to New York, for what is life when separated from my kind William? But a touch of sun and time to settle in soon awakened Johnston to the charms and curiosities of this, quote, very salubrious spot. She would have recognized dozens of familiar faces from Savannah there, though Georgia this was not. She could see that much in the compressed shells of the coquina stone houses, the balustrades of the former Convento de San Francisco, now the Army Barracks, and the colorful presence of Minorcans and other Mediterranean islanders who had been recruited a decade earlier as laborers for a settlement farther south. Johnston enjoyed promenades along the broad, pointed ramparts ringing the city, the breeze slapping against her skirts. And what a pleasure it was, after the supply shortages of wartime Savannah and Charleston, to feast on fish caught fresh from the sea. I never was in better health, and indeed never was so fleshy as during my residence there, she later remembered. Best of all, William got leave for a brief visit from New York, and they could plan their future face to face. Could it be that Loyalists would achieve in East Florida what 2 decades of imaginative British colonization efforts had not, making profitable plantations out of subtropical swamps, flourishing towns from struggling outposts? And these were the hopes of many of the people there. In the event, in April 1783, the news of the peace treaty hit East Florida Loyalists like a hurricane. Article 5 of the peace with the United States, which neutered the possibility of receiving compensation from the states, paled for them next to Article 5 of Britain's peace with Spain and France, by which Britain agreed to cede East and West Florida to Spain with no strings attached. It had seemed like a reasonable arrangement to British diplomats, who were more committed to keeping the strategically valuable Gibraltar than the economically disappointing Florida. But the treaty yanked the ground from beneath the refugees' feet. They had already undergone the ordeal of leaving their homes under duress, often more than once, and accepted the challenge of starting over in an underdeveloped land. Now even this hard-won asylum was denied them, and by their own government at that. Unless Loyalists were prepared to swear allegiance to the King of Spain and practice Catholicism, they had 18 months to gather up their possessions and go. The war never occasioned half the distress which this peace has done to the unfortunate Loyalists, Elizabeth Johnston wrote. No other provision made than just recommending them to the clemency of Congress, which is in fact casting them off altogether. And so the Johnstons become one of these many thousands of refugees in Florida who now have to move again. And they cast about figuring out where to go next. They explore the possibilities of Jamaica, of the Bahamas, different sorts of regions. And finally, the majority of the Florida Loyalists end up going to the Bahamas, but the Johnstons have another option. They're reasonably well off. They have a lot of slaves. And Elizabeth Johnston's father is able to sell off these slaves and use the proceeds to move on, in their case, to Britain. Britain, you'll detect a theme in all of these places. The Loyalists were not very happy in the places that they ended up going, and Britain was no exception. The Johnstons end up settling in Edinburgh because William Johnston is a medical student, and at that time Edinburgh had the best medical school in the Anglophone world. So they go there. He finishes his medical training, but like many of these refugees, they find that the opportunities for employment are not so great. You know, there's already a lot of professionals there in Britain, and they don't necessarily need these colonial upstarts to come and fill in the ranks. And so they move on again, and they go under the patronage of a wartime supporter of William's to Jamaica. And the last part of their story that I'll tell you about in a little more depth is their experience in Jamaica, which at the time was the richest colony in the British Empire and seemed, on the face of it, a very alluring place for the refugees. Its beauty could take your breath away. From the sparkling surface of the water, your gaze swept sharply up to the craggy blue mountains, climbing into the clouds. Over the rippled slopes fell a living green blanket, textured in the weird vegetable forms of the tropics: giant ferns and tufted bromeliads, flap-eared plantains, muscular trees draped in epiphytes, careening stands of bamboo and sinewy palms. When you turned past the outer lip of the harbor, you floated over the broken stones of the old capital of Port Royal, mostly destroyed in a 1692 earthquake. The gleaming sand swept around the shoreline to Kingston, Port Royal's replacement, the greatest British metropolis in the Caribbean. Gulls sliced circles around the masts. The sun cut the water into liquid diamonds. No wonder Loyalists were captivated by it. Such hills, such mountains, and such verdure, everything so bright and gay, it is delightful, gushed one new arrival on cruising toward this spectacular landscape. An 18th century aesthete effusively compared the Bay of Kingston to the Bay of Naples, with the Blue Mountains standing in for Vesuvius and the submerged ruins of Port Royal like a phantom Pompeii under the sea. Others let the grandeur and sublimity simply overcome them, knocking language from their lips. Whatever else Loyalist refugees knew of this lush island, they could see it wasn't the 13 colonies anymore. Now, Jamaica was a very wealthy place. It had these wonderful sugar plantations. It generated enormous amounts of wealth for Britain. On the other hand, the very things that made it so rich also made it rather challenging as an environment for white refugees. One of the features of its being a tropical island was that it was ridden with disease, about which I will say more in a moment. Another is that that made it so wealthy is that it had these big plantations which were worked by gigantic numbers of slaves. And the ratio of slaves to whites on the island was something like 8-to-1, 10-to-1. The whites were a tiny minority. They lived in constant terror that there would be slave uprisings that would knock them all out. And white women were particularly rare on Jamaica because, for the most part, the people who actually lived there, the whites who actually lived there, were professionals involved in the plantation business, and very few whites actually made a family life on Jamaica. So Elizabeth Johnston finds herself in this environment, which, seems to be really full of promise, and yet turns out to be a very alienating, sort of lonely place. And so William Johnston is very busy kind of working here, curing and attempting to cure all of these diseases, which are all over, particularly things like yellow fever. But Elizabeth feels fairly isolated. And I'll read you a little bit about their life there. Now, Johnston is a doctor on a slave plantation, so he's treating a lot of black patients. But he continued to treat white patients as well. A Pan-American yellow fever epidemic in 1793 proved a bonanza to his practice when his merchant clients in Kingston called on him to attend the sick sailors on their incoming ships. Yellow fever produces internal bleeding and jaundice. It starts with a headache, then fever, nausea, and vomiting. When the vomit turns black and gritty with blood, it is almost over. The victim is usually dead within days. Dr. Johnston eschewed the technique of bloodletting that other doctors prescribed for the disease, though as he dosed one heaving patient after another with calomel, a mercury solution given as a purgative, his treatment may have harmed as much as it helped. Sometimes there were 17 or more funerals a day, Elizabeth Johnston remembered with distress. At their family house in Halfway Tree, just outside Kingston, she had a large Jamaica-born brood of young children to worry about. Eliza, born in 1787, Lelea Peyton in 1789, then John, Jane Farley, and James Wildman. Johnston congratulated herself that none of her family contracted yellow fever, but their resistance to the island's diseases would not last much longer. By the end of 1793, the Johnstons' youngest daughter, Jane, was dead of scarlet fever, aged 2. You could not avoid death, but you could try to come to terms with it. As if to replace the lost child, the Johnstons named their newest infant, born in 1794, Jane Farley, as well. With her, the Johnstons weren't taking any chances. Because of William's constant exposure to smallpox, he arranged to have the baby girl inoculated. Although the procedure had become widespread in Britain by then, in Jamaica by then, there was always some risk that rather than developing antibodies to fight off the controlled infection, the patient might contract a fatal case of smallpox instead. Parents anxiously monitored the incisions where the virus had been applied to make sure the infection did not spread. The second Jane Farley Johnston, just 3 months old, was not so lucky. After lying on my lap for some time on a pillow, a very sad spectacle, one sore being quite black, she died in my arms, her angelic blue eyes never to open again. William carried the small body from Elizabeth's lap, and she collapsed on the floor, convulsed in grief and prayers. She had lost 2 children already, one in Edinburgh, another in Jamaica. But this bereavement touched Elizabeth Johnston more deeply than any other. Perhaps it had something to do with the sense that she could have stopped it, that she had actually approved and probably watched when the fatal germs were applied. But to be there in that strange, suffocating place with nothing familiar around her, quote, having no female relation to be with me, only black servants, and having to think about and direct everything for so many little ones, unquote, it seemed too much to bear. Much exhausted in mind and body, quote unquote, she fell into a serious depression. Not long after the baby's death, the patron family, the Wildmans, offered to adopt the Johnstons' daughter, Eliza, and take her with them to Britain. We could not for some weeks make up our minds to part with her, Johnston confessed, as they wrestled with a dilemma that faced generations of parents in inhospitable imperial outposts. Is it better to keep the children close to home, exposed to tropical dangers, or to send them thousands of miles away, home to distant Britain? and they end up sending the children back. As the inexorable pressures of mortality closed in around them, the Johnstons discovered Jamaica to be a false refuge for them, too. Though William had succeeded where many Southern refugees had not by carving out a professional career, the hostility of this alien environment broke down his family both physically and psychologically. In 1796, a debilitated Elizabeth Johnston admitted defeat. She decided to return to Edinburgh with the children as a duty both to their health and their morals, quote unquote, while William, who had to stay at the practice, remained in Jamaica. Fully 40 years later, the grief still welled up inside her when she remembered, quote, the morning of that sad day when I heard that the boat was come to take us on board for another separation, another Atlantic crossing. I hardly think I was in my senses. I uttered screams that distressed my poor husband to such a degree that he would then have been glad if I had given up going. He begged me to let him go on board and bring our things back, but all I could say was, it is too late. But as the figures on the docks dwindled into blurs and dots, and the ruins of Port Royal shimmered away beneath the ship, and the green-blue mountains receded into gray outlines, she drew strength from a fresh source. In her darkest hours of mourning and isolation, Johnston had been saved. She saw the arms of an unfamiliar God stretched out to embrace her, a loving, accessible presence, the God of the Baptists. The old Anglican pieties she had been trying to console herself with since Florida seemed merely cold morality, quote-unquote, to her now. She found solace in the preaching of the dissenters, which has been the means of awakening many a poor soul. Her own path to conversion through personal upheaval and distress seemed to crystallize the larger process of recovery across an Anglo-American world torn by war. She had lost so much in Jamaica, but this discovery she could carry with her always. It was just as well for Elizabeth Johnston, whose memoir that she wrote much later is saturated in this religious language, that she did have this experience, because things would go on in a similar way. Lots of migrations, lots of losses, lots of separations. And so it was finally, after back and forth across the Atlantic between this couple, more deaths of children, more travails, that finally in 1806, 30 years after the Declaration of Independence, Elizabeth Johnston finally moved to Nova Scotia, the #1 retreat for Loyalist refugees. She arrived there within 6 months. Her husband, William, had died in Jamaica. She stayed on in Nova Scotia and ended up having her family around her going forward. And so just a final word on Elizabeth Johnston. That by the end, by a generation after the war, many of them, like her, had found resting places. And by the time Johnston rehearsed the events of her life for her memoirs in 1837, she was 73 years old. Her sight was dimmed by cataracts, her memory twisted around old traumas like a tree growing around barbed wire, all those movements, all those separations, and so many deaths. She had come of age during a civil war and spent decades of her adult life coping with dislocation and bereavement. Yet there was no anger in Johnston's recollections, nor any nostalgic longing for her lost home. If anything, she sounded rather self-satisfied, for she had rooted herself in a new home now. Little did I think that I and all my family would ultimately settle in Nova Scotia, she recalled. While she achieved a stability and social comfort she had never before known, her surviving children became prominent members of Nova Scotia's professional and political elite, in some cases achieving positions of higher status than they could ever have plausibly enjoyed had they remained in the United States. After all their trials and migrations, the Johnstons had arrived and evolved from American loyalists into British North American patriots. To follow Johnston's narrative, these losers were winners in the end. And I'll leave it at that and happily take questions.
Now, beyond the United Empire, Loyalists in Canada, I was wondering if you get a sense if there's this strong self-identification as loyalist in these other areas that the loyalist diaspora spread across.
Beyond the United Empire Loyalists in Canada, the answer would be no. And I think that the reason for that is that the Loyalists are, at the beginning, subjects of the British Empire, and at the end, they're also subjects of the British Empire. And so I see the absence of this kind of nostalgia, lost cause sort of thinking as a reflection of the fact that they are successfully absorbed into a refurbished British Empire. And Johnston is one example, of course, in Canada, where this is most pronounced, but you see versions of that elsewhere in the diaspora as well.
I've read the first 100 pages, so I'm anxious to get to the end, but I was struck by the number of black loyalists. I mean, it seemed a full third of the group. When they went to these other places, did the fact that they were suddenly free blacks have any effect on the pace of abolition in any of these parts of the British Empire?
It did. Of the Loyalists who left, it's about a sixth who are free blacks, which is the same ratio as in the colonies. Now, abolitionism was a sentiment that had been articulated in the run-up to the American Revolution in Britain, where slavery was effectively illegal from 1772 onward. But the Revolution gives it a real sort of push forward because these influential slave owners are no longer part of the empire, and partly because there is this new large black population that's free, that's been freed during the war. And Britons see this increasingly as a contrast, one of these moral contrasts, that by upholding black freedom, they're different from Americans who are enshrining black slavery as they see it. So yes, I mean, the American Revolution is seen as a kind of galvanizing factor in accelerating the abolitionist cause in the British Empire, and the 1780s is a time of enormous popular abolitionism in Britain and the Empire. It should be said, despite the British even to this day are very celebratory of this tradition, and there's a lot of sort of reverence paid to those early abolitionists. It must be said that the slave trade was not abolished for a whole generation yet, but there's no doubt that the idea that there would be free blacks and that their freedom would be upheld by Britain was really gaining ground in those years.
I'm curious about one particular person who you mention in the book, which goes beyond just the general picture, namely the son of Benjamin Franklin. William, I think it was his name?
Yes.
And the question in terms of writing of history, to what extent was it really political loyalty to Britain that made him take the other side, or was the fact that his father, as he probably perceived him, de facto abandoned his mother, he rarely saw her, and I wonder with this famous Oedipal conflict with father and taking side of mother and so on, to what extent this played itself out in this case, and in writing of history in general, how much do we know about the personal factors which happen to be known. And I think Franklin father was quite a flirt too, which son probably knew about. So I was wondering, what is the motives, the way you read, why was that particular case became a loyalist?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to say is, so the case that the gentleman refers to is that Benjamin Franklin, our great founding father, his own son, William, was a well-known loyalist. He was the governor of New Jersey. He ended up being imprisoned as a loyalist and became ultimately a leader of the loyalist community in occupied New York, and then a bitter and disheartened refugee in Britain. Now, the rift between them was a deeply felt one. William was Benjamin's only son, only child. They were, or not only child, only son, and they basically ceased communication because of this. And this became particularly significant at the time of the peace negotiations at the end of the war, in which Benjamin Franklin was one of the key U.S. negotiators. And, over the course of many, many months, the five peace negotiators are meeting in Paris, and they're hashing out all of the terms of the independence of the United States. And there are lots and lots of sticking points along the way, but they resolve all of them until they get to one last one in the kind of fall of 1782, I guess it is. And the sticking point concerns whether the U.S. is going to be made responsible for giving compensation to loyalists whose property has been confiscated during the war. And on this point, most of the other American negotiators are okay with it, John Adams and John Jay. But Benjamin Franklin will not give in on this point, and he says, if you grant compensation, I'm not going to sign the treaty. We have to keep on fighting the war. So if you want an Oedipal, the reverse, and it anticipates his own a later act of sort of property-related vengeance. He largely writes William out of his will later, and the two again rarely ever meet again. So I think these family divides do matter, and I do think, I suppose for me, what I think about most is that getting into personalities and getting into individual experience is really important for explaining how history has operated.
You say in your introduction that this is the first book about the Loyalists, exiles, the refugees. Now that you've written this, what do you feel should be the second book about these? Not necessarily by you, but by somebody else who picks up from where you left off. Well, if someone else picks up from where you left off, what would you like to see as the next book on this topic?
That's a great question. I think, one thing that needs to be written up in a better form is what happens to the Loyalists who don't leave. There's a lot of sort of dissertations on this, some very recent. There are some monographs, but I'd like to see more about the reintegration of Loyalists and how that might change our picture of the creation of a union in the early republic. So that would be the kind of American history side. There's also a kind of international history, which I think would be a natural next step. Maybe, I don't think I'll do it, but I'm more inclined toward this, which is that, the American Revolution is seen as the beginning of the age of revolutions, right? There's revolutions in France and Haiti. There's a lot of upheaval in Latin America. And in all of this period, the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars ending in 1815, there's an enormous amount of political switching and movement and refugees leaving from Haiti and from France and from all over the world. And I would love to see some sort of book that is able to, apply similar sorts of approaches to looking at the mixed loyalties of figures caught in these other revolutionary movements. And there's, I think, a really interesting history to be written about the shape of the United States in connection with some of these schemes. And I think also a kind of interesting comparative history to be done about the British Empire, the French Empire, and American ambitions in places like South America through these figures.
We have time for one or two more questions if anyone else has one to add. Well, maybe this is a good time to have the book signing. Thank you so much.
Thanks all for coming.
We'll have the book signing right up here. Please find the book available for purchase up at the...
This event took place at the Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts. To find out more, visit harvard.com.
Let us return, therefore, to the child man, the young single dude